worthy rabbis, rabbanim, Rashi Yeshiva, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful to you, Dr. Gancherau, for those beautiful words. I told him it was beautifully overdone. I was almost expecting him after that wonderful vart about Havdalah to introduce me as Rabbi Norman Lamb LaHavdil. But I am very grateful for all those wonderful words. I would like to be humble and take exception to what he said about me, but I always recall the words of Justice Cardozo, who, when he was introduced with lavish praise, said, "I am singularly accessible to demonstrations of regard." So I'm not going to fight it. If that's what you think, thank you. I'm really grateful for the tribute you've expressed to me, especially since I have been associated with the Orthodox Union for almost my entire career. And I am pleased that my working relations with the OU leadership, from the visionary days of Mo Feuerstein to the enormously focused, effective, and successful era of Mendy Gancherau, have been felicitous and friendly and fruitful. This award, therefore, is most meaningful to me, Mendy, and I thank you for it. I feel even more honored by being included in the group of distinguished rabbis who are my co-honorees. As one who has been in the rabbinate, the pulpit rabbinate, for 25 years and out of it now for a bit over 20 years, I think I'm in a good position to evaluate the worth of the pulpit rabbis to American Jewish orthodoxy. And I tell you without exaggeration that these 11 men are the unsung heroes of Torah Judaism. Echad mi yodea, achadasar mi yodea, achadasar ani yodea, achadasar kol chvaya. They are 11 stars in the firmament of American Jewry. They are representative as well of the hundreds of pulpit rabbis throughout the country. These men throughout the country, so often taken for granted, work hard and work assiduously, usually outside the confined perimeters of the bustling centers of Judaism and the yeshivas with their consuming intensity. They're the sentinels of Yiddishkeit in America, and I am proud that the Orthodox Union is recognizing them and the colleagues whom they represent. They and the OU are worthy of our most heartfelt approbation. Permit me to share with you a problem that causes me, and I suppose many of us, deep distress. We stand today at a most critical juncture of Jewish history. Our generation must make a fateful decision. Will we remain one people or fragmented to two or more peoples, unable to marry each other and therefore permanently divided from each other, chas v'shalom? Since the beginning of our story, it has been the Torah that has kept us as one, despite all these centrifugal forces that have determined to pull us apart. With the weakening of Torah study and observance at the beginning of the modern age, we have tended to become unglued and atomized. The fact of our disunity now looms over us like some giant threatening presence, one that we deny at our own peril. So the question is, what role does Torah play in this unfolding drama? Never before has Torah been accused of being the focus and the cause of our disunity. Yet today, it is precisely the charge that is leveled against it. There are those who use the Torah as a weapon against orthodoxy. They tell us that our rigidity is the cause of the woes of our people. Others tell us that we were never united. The unity of Israel is a myth, a fantasy, a legend, and therefore our present disunity should not worry us so much. And many in the Haredi world act as if disunity was inevitable. So where do we, of the community represented by the OU, stand? Are we blameless? Do we believe we were or should be one people? Can we persuade others and ourselves that Torah is indeed the source of our cohesiveness, that it is not the cause for divisiveness? I think it is and should be clear to all of us that the approach of the non-Orthodox groups will lead us into disaster. If there's more than one way to enter the Jewish fold, and if one of those ways is non-halachic, then it will lead not to the kind of disunity that now afflicts us, but to something infinitely worse. And that is the breakup of our one people into two or more nations, unable officially, and I stress the word officially and legally, to intermarry with each other. Consider this situation. We do not recognize most of conservative conversions. Some, most. The conservative movement, if they are true to their own convictions, will not accept reform converts. Furthermore, the Israeli reform do not recognize American reform because they will not accept patrilineal Jews and they do not approve of same-sex marriages. So far, I count 4 different groups who cannot intermarry with each other. Is this what we want, what they want? Will the Israeli Supreme Court support such a result in the name of civil rights? The Haredim are accommodating themselves to the idea that unity is impossible, that we are already broken up into 2 separate peoples. The lead article in this past January 20th Yediot Achronot tells it all. It's entitled, Nipared ki yedidim. Let's part as friends and be 2 separate people. I must tell you a personal incident that happened to me. I don't want to name names. A number of years ago, about 6, 7 years ago, I was asked to visit a famous Hasidic Rebbe in Yerushalayim, a really distinguished man. It was a wonderful conversation, but I came to him with an argument. I had read in the newspaper of his movement that the editor wrote an article and he said, מה פתאום מדברים על כלל ישראל לפי החשבון שלנו אין בכלל ישראל יותר ממיליון נפשות. Why are people speaking of Klal Yisrael? Our count, there are no more than 1 million people in Klal Yisrael. So I said to him, Rebbe Levin, I ask you, Rebbe, tell me, my parents who then were alive, my wife, my children, my grandchildren, are we part of Klal Yisrael or are we not part of Klal Yisrael? I will never forget his answer. Very quietly and with great dignity, he said, Rav Lam, ifreit zi har bakashe. You're asking too difficult a question. Now, you interpret that. The struggle in Israel about conversions is beset with all kinds of arcane nuances, confounded by confusion, with currents and countercurrents permeated with political cabals and machinations. But if we break down the arguments on both sides to their constituent essences and seek out the fundamental values that are at issue, we will succeed in simplifying the issue, I think, without being simplistic. The heart of the matter is, which should prevail, the wholeness of Torah or the unity of our people? The right holds that we must maintain the hegemony of Torah even at the expense of the oneness of Am Yisrael. The left holds we must strive to effect the unity of Israel even if it means chipping away or compromising the halakha. The conflict is not completely new. According to the Gemara Sanhedrin, Moshe and Aaron are the archetypes of these 2 different attitudes. Moshe, the Gemara says, Hayome Yikov Hadin Esahar. It's an idiom which means the law, halacha, justice prevails over everything. Aval Aharon, Ohev Shalom, V'odev Shalom, V'meisim Shalom, V'odam L'chavero. Loves, pursues peace, brings peace amongst man and his fellow man. Moses symbolized the preeminence of law and principle, Aaron of peace and unity. The Tana de Belial, we are told that in a contest between Ahavas Yisrael and Ahavas Torah, Ahavas Yisrael prevails. In the Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages, of Sadyagon declared that Ein Umma Seinu Umma Ela B'Shvil HaTorah, our people is a people only by virtue of the Torah. while later on Yehuda Halevi, in his Kuzari and elsewhere, held that Israel was the constant, unchanging pole, the element without which Torah could not and would not have been given to the world. So how should we decide the current issue? Which will predominate? The integrity of halacha or the unity of Klal Yisrael? Do we insist on halachic conversion with all the chumras piled up over time in order to keep it whole beyond challenge and make sure it's totally pure? Or even if we thereby alienate whole sections of American Jewry and 200,000 non-Russian, non-Jewish Russian immigrants? Or do we embrace all comers within reason, even if that means compromising the halacha itself? And my answer is clear. In our present situation, we dare not ask such a question because it is a prematurely forced and therefore false dichotomy. In the Shoah period, when the Nazis were bored by ordinary torture of Jews, they devised very sophisticated psychological tortures in order to reach the zenith of the sadism. They would take a man and say, here's your father and your mother, and you tell us which one shall we kill, because if you don't give an answer, we kill them both. Think of it. To force us to choose between our father and our mother, between halacha and Am Yisrael, is a cruel and inhuman demand. Yes, under extreme, dreadful conditions, it is conceivable that we would have to decide which to choose and which to abandon. But to ponder the question over dinner, over a cocktail, and choose sides before every single solution has been examined and every avenue of solution has been tested is an act of gargantuan irresponsibility. The presumption that the two values are locked in mortal combat is an abstraction that in the context of our own particular and peculiar predicament is utterly misleading. We must hold on to both elements for dear life. No Jew has the moral right cavalierly to be mafkia thousands of fellow Jews. And no Jew has the right to dispense with the integrity of halacha, which is the source of our spiritual and communal existence and the only guarantee that generations after us will remain Jewish. Moreover, the problem is formulated in a way that assumes that Torah has no special place or regard for the wholeness of Klal Yisrael. But that is simply not so. When our ancestors left Egypt on the way to Har Sinai in Revelation, we read, Bayom Hazeh Ba'u Midbar Sinai. On this day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And Rashi says, Bayom Hazeh, quotes a Chazal. Why does it say Bayom Hazeh? This day it should be Bayom Hahu. On that day, after all, this is written with a perspective. On that day they came. Why on this day? And Rashi says, again quoting Chazal, Sheyihiu divrei Torah chadashim be'einecha ki'ilu hayom nitnu. To teach us that the words of Torah shall be new, fresh, vigorous, even as the very day that they were given. It's a beautiful sentiment. But there's an inaccuracy or an anachronism lurking in the background someplace. The Sfas Emes Rebbe asks, how do these two words, Bayom Hazeh, prove that Divrei Torah have to be Chadashim Be'einecha, when the Torah was not yet given? They were just coming to Sinai. How can you say that Yom Hazeh refers to the newness, the freshness of Torah when it was several days later that it was given? And in answer to his own question, he points to the very next pasuk. Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. Israel camped there. You know the Rashi, a famous Chazal on that. The Torah switches suddenly from the plural, they, and comes to the singular. Vayichan, he, it, camped there. Why is that? Because to tell us that when Israel came to Har Sinai, they were Ish Echad, B'leiv echad, they were like one person with one heart. They were one organic whole. They were totally united. Their togetherness probably not known to that extent before or after. And here the Ger Rebbe adds one element. He says this very factor of the utter Jewish unity is in and of itself an aspect of Torah. That is a part of Torah. That we are one people, ke'ish echad b'leiv echad, is a requirement, a demand, and a value of Torah. It is not merely a psychological or sociological phenomenon. It is a spiritual value. It is Torah. The author of which is the Rabbanu Shalom, whose name is also Shalom. For that too is the name of God. And since that is Torah, it is no longer an anachronism to say that the words She'iyu divrei Torah chadoshim b'yanecha kayom shenitnu applies this to this as well. So if we recognize that unity of Klal Yisrael is a fundamental of Torah, then that has standing in halacha, then it will pose we cannot pose it as an antagonist to Torah. It is part of Torah. I therefore lead to a practical thing. I congratulate the Orthodox Union leadership for its courageous support of the recommendations of the Ne'eman Commission. V'ne'eman hu ba'al malachtecha sheyeshalem lecha schar pu'lasech. Before we go further on this theme, it is important to confirm the fundamental attitude that marks our community and its attitude towards the non-Orthodox world, our non-Orthodox brethren, and to ourselves. A few weeks ago, we read about the Eser Makos, the 10 plagues, and the second plague was, shouldn't mention it while we're reading, frogs. The Torah says, and here again we have a singular plural play, Vaya'al Batal Hasvardeya, the frog rose, the frog came upon Egypt. And of course the question Rashi asks immediately is it should be Vaya'alu Hasvardeim, the frogs came. After all, the plague was that there was a swarm of frogs. And one of the answers Rashi gives is that Svardeya Achasai, so really there was only one frog. What happened is Hayu Makenosa, they beat it, they struck it. As a result, he matezes it nechilim, it began to sprout or give forth, issue forth, emit just strings and strings of frogs, so many that they became a plague for all of Egypt. Picture is beautiful, isn't it? Reb Itzalem Volozhin, the second Rosh Yeshiva of the great famous Volozhin Yeshiva says, if they had only bothered to talk to the frog instead of beating it, it would have remained one frog. It wouldn't have bothered everyone. But because they came to a machlokes and to a struggle, and they began to beat it over the head, as a result, hundreds of thousands of frogs came through, and the result was a plague of frogs all over the land. And then he adds the following words, and I'm quoting here because it's a recently discovered vart in a recently discovered manuscript by the Netziv, recently published. He says as follows, Kamokain b'ma'avak neged hakitot v'hatanuot hachadashot hakamot b'Yisrael. Similarly, with regard to the new movements in Israel, he's referring to the Enlightenment, the Haskalah. Yesh linhog k'fi shehoreh maran hagrach. We must conduct ourselves as my father, Reb Chaim Mivolozhin taught us. Shelo lalechet b'derech shel tigra u'milchama gluya. Not to go in the way of battles and open war. Ba'asher etzem ha'itnatzchut meviyal hitchazkut shel hatzad shegeneged. The very fact of an open struggle only helps the opposition. It gives them more courage to continue their battle. Everyone, it seems, everyone in our world is beating the frog. We are in an attack mode. Every argument is extravagant, exaggerated, and above all, loud. And we must not be drawn into such shouting matches. We must absolutely remain firm in our ideas, in the battle of ideas, but never react, with the snide sneers and intemperate charges that have characterized our Jewish polemics for too long. Let us talk before we strike, lest we be overwhelmed by a plague of the equivalent of a swarm of ugly reptiles. Equally and even more important is how we view ourselves. And I want to tell you, my friends, it's about time we grew up. It's about time that we achieved a degree of self-confidence in what we are and what we stand for. Let's stop fighting and let's stop fidgeting and hemming and hawing and say outright who we are and what we are. We are fully committed to Torah. We abide by halacha without question. We cherish and obey every mitzvah. We have deep respect for Gedolei HaTorah, whether or not we agree with them or are happy what they decide. At the same time, we hold that Torah Umada is a principle and not a concession. We do not believe that orthodoxy requires of us to seal off our minds from the worlds of society, of science, and the best of modern culture. We affirm that Medinas Yisrael has special significance for us and is not the same as any other polity. It's not the same as any other country, but they speak Hebrew. We affirm that the welfare of all Klal Yisrael is a major concern to us, and we do not advocate any narrow definition of the term Klal Yisrael. Let's say these things with pride and equally without arrogance or apology. If we stand for moderation, it is not because, like little children, we are afraid of loud noises. We do not take the Mishnah's teaching, Hevu Musunim Badim, to be moderate in judgment as a form of etiquette for those aspiring to high-class delicacy. It is for us a norm of judicial conduct that obligates every Jew and especially B'nai Torah. Hence, while our manner of expression and the quality of our relationship is matun, it's moderate, our basic commitment allows no softness in yielding on principle for the sake of good fellowship. To the contrary, it is our firmness of conviction that allows us to be moderate and dignified towards those with whom we disagree on fundamentals. We should not by any means minimize our differences with the non-Orthodox world. The fact that we prefer civility to shouting does not mean that we should be mute, or we should mute our profound unhappiness at some of the outrageous innovations they have visited upon us in recent years. A Polish poet writing about the Shoah wrote, "I would want to keep silent, but my silence would tell a lie. Such silence is not for us." For those of faltering faith in this, our vision of Yiddishkeit, let me recall to you those whom we regard as our predecessors, who inspire us and in whose light we flourish, beginning with the Rambam and the Maharal and Rav Reines and Rav Kook and Rabbis Hirsch and Hildesheim and Rav Herzog and the Ravs at Zeichat Tzadikim Levracha. It is their teaching and their Hashkafas HaOlam, and it is these and only a few of whom, these are only a few of whom, of those whom we regard as our ideological ancestors, regardless of the differences amongst these staunchly independent thinkers and Tzadikei Yesod Olam. They are our teachers and our guides. And let's not be distracted or discouraged by opposition, even or especially when such opposition is not in the realm of ideas and ideals, but is expressed with hostility and contempt and hatred, perhaps especially when antagonism is formulated in scurrilous personal terms. Don't forget that the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim was burnt on the altar of a Dominican church by the equivalent of what you would call the most militant Kanaim. Such opposition would never bother the Rambam, who wrote in a letter, "I would rather please one intelligent person, even if I have to displease 10,000 ignoramuses." Recall that Rav Kook was vilified mercilessly, and to this day, a sefer that is Kulo Kodesh, but happens to be published by a publishing house called Mossad Rav Kook, will not be allowed into certain Batei Medrash, not all of course, but certain Batei Medrash, because the name cook appears on the binding. And I need not tell you how the Rav suffered from, well, ways that people you know, I don't want to go into it, by people who very often repeat this Chedushim in their own names. So we're in good company if we suffer from similar assaults. Let me now return, friends, to the problem of unity, and especially to its halachic dimension. The Rambam in Hilchas Shabbos, discussing the halacha that life takes precedence over Shabbat, over Shabbos, says that when you have a problem of life, of pikuach nefesh, danger to life, you're allowed to violate the laws of Shabbos. And he says, Hol amadata, from this you learn, she'ein mishpatei haTorah nekama ba'olam. The laws of the Torah are not an act of malevolence, an act of revenge against the world. El rachamim v'chesed v'shalom ba'olam. They are the harbingers of peace and kindness and compassion for the world. And he says that those who say that you have to violate the Shabbos, even when you have to observe the Shabbos, even if it means pikuach nefesh, he refers to them as minim, the most severe form of heretics. So let's be open about it. It's easy enough to remain pat and unmovable and ignore the real needs of ordinary men and women, the lives of people, and dismiss the consequences of our decisions, and thus unintentionally prove the halacha is indeed a form of nekama against mankind. But let it be clear, the alternative to such rigidity is not to play fast and loose with halacha. There are no quick fixes in halacha. Halachic method works by precedent and proof, slowly and conservatively, citing sources, consulting chaverim, others, colleagues. Quickie solutions form the quicksand of reputations and ought to be studiously avoided. Gedolei Yisrael through the generations certainly were sensitive to the needs of individuals, and they responded not despite halacha, but through halacha. What we must demonstrate in our times is precisely this. Authentic halacha is not an angry, wrathful, vindictive system. Torah is not out to make life unbearable for Jews. On the contrary, properly understood and interpreted, it is a source of life and the guarantee of peace. Yet we are constantly criticized and told that halacha is inadequate to deal with the stormy and complex issues of our age because of the stand-pat policy of our poskim and the lack of concern for the social, economic, political consequences of their decisions. But I tell you that that is simply not true. Allow me to share with you the essence of a tshuva by one of the great meshivim, the great poskim of all generations. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Reisha of late 17th century Prague in his immortal work, Shvus Yaakov. I'm giving it to you not for specifics, this is not a shiur in halacha, but simply as an example of the halachic method and as a symbol and a paradigm for our times. In a case, or certain cases, where a man drowned at sea, and there's no island or other ship in sight. And here's a case that was brought to his attention, a man drowned. I expected it. Don't get excited. Okay. No, let him go quiet. After what I said, you think I had to set the whole thing up. It's, you know. Anyway, let's get back to serious things. Here's a case of brought to him a man drowned at sea about a year and a half earlier. And there's a question now that's brought to the Rabbi Yaakov Reisha of ascertaining the death, because the law is that the wife may not remarry, but if she did, she need not divorce her second husband. In other words, lechatchila, she is considered married to the first husband who was lost at sea, but b'di'evad, if she remarried without permission, we do not consider the second marriage adulterous or the progeny of that marriage illegitimate. Now, a woman comes before the Beis Din, and Having a case of this sort, a husband is lost at sea and no adequate witnesses, etc. Mayim she'ein lehem sof. And we decide, according to halacha, she is forbidden to marry. She will remain an aguna, chained, probably for the rest of her life. Is there any way to release her from her aguna status so she can live a normal life? The Shvus Yaakov decided in her favor, based on solid sources, plus the exercise of brilliance and enormous courage. And here's what he says. Everything that b'di'eved, having been done, is muta, we permit l'chatchila to begin with if it is a shas adchak, if there's an emergency situation. And since this aguna is caught in an impossible situation, it's a shas adchak, and therefore, even though the halacha is that the chatchila she may not remarry, since it's a shas adchak, we permit it to marry immediately. But you will say, isn't every aguna a case of shas adchak? He says, no. If she's an old lady and her husband is lost at sea, she hasn't got any people who are wooing her, who want to marry her. Permitted to remarry, and ein lefakvek bal haterada, no one should protest this particular heta. There is such a thing as finding a way out when there's a shas adchak that's very terrible. This was the way of Gedolim throughout the ages. And by analogy, with a nation, when we find ourselves nationally in a state of shas adchak, of true emergency and distress, if we refrain from treating b'di'eved as l'chatchila as only one example of making use of other halachic remedies, we will bear the responsibility of an irreparable breach in the unity of Israel for generations without end. It will very well push masses of Jews into tarbut tzeda'ah, simply to abandoning Yiddishkeit, just as the Shvus Yaakov feared. In effect, it will be two parts of the people of Israel who will separate, repeating that awful mistake that was made in antiquity after the reign of Shlomo HaMelech, where we split into two kingdoms. And we will be two permanent agunos, outwardly indistinguishable from each other. You're not able to marry each other forever, and therefore in a perpetual state of alienation, hostility, and hatred. And this is not an exaggeration. This is a very real possibility, chas v'shalom. So Orthodox leadership sometimes may find itself in a position where it has to give way on the lechatchila in order to preserve both the primacy of halacha and the integrity of Klal Yisrael, which, as I said before, itself is a value of Torah. At the same time, we must drive hard to exact from the non-Orthodox that they do no less than we in sacrificing for Klal Yisrael by yielding on their claims of their clerical autonomy, denominational equality, or institutional pride. All of this for the sake of the interrelations and wholeness of our people. When such remedies are available, we must recognize the critical shas adchak of our times and act accordingly, both responsibly and courageously, and applaud those who make it possible. We repeat often the extremely important reassurance, Lo Alman Yisrael. Alman Yisrael is not a widow or a widower. And indeed, they are comforting and true words. We will not be abandoned by a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and we will always have Gedolim who will guide us properly. But that's a task for the Rabbanu Shalom. Our task, the enormous burden that rests on our shoulders in our generation, especially in this critical period of Jewish history, is not only to proclaim Lo Alman Yisrael, but also to declare and realize and emphasize with equal vigor and determination and promise that we make that Lo Aguna Yisrael, that there is little doubt, and there is little doubt that the state of Aguna may even be worse than that of an Alman or an Almana. We must not permit the dogmatists and exclusionists to preach that unity is not desirable. We must not allow the cynics and the self-proclaimed realists to tell us that unity never existed and hence never will. Chazal told us that in the tefillin of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is proclaimed the unity of Yisrael, Mi Ka'amcha Yisrael, Goy Echad Ba'aretz, and we should not passel the tefillin of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, because Ata Echad v'Shimcha Echad. So with clear-eyed vision and with hearts dedicated to the Rabbanu Shalom and His holy Torah, with backbones to act courageously despite criticism, and with stiff-necked insistence that we will not falter in advancing simultaneously both the unity of Klal Yisrael and the integrity of Torah Yisrael, we may turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and pray for His divine aid in our efforts to advance His cause in the world, so that Kol Atzmosai Tomarna, with our fullness of body and heart and soul, we say, Barcheinu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad, bless us, our Father in heaven, all of us together, Ke'echad, as if we were one. That even though we suffer sharp differences with each other, sometimes act irresponsibly instead of as friends, notwithstanding our impatience and our impertinence towards each other, despite our occasional outbursts of temper and use of intemperate language, bless us, Ke'echad, to act as if we were one, united in a common destiny, living with each other like brothers and sisters in a family who may have radically different points of view, and yet recognizing that we are related by blood and by fate, and yes, with ahava v'achva, shalom v'reis, with compassion and even with love, for there can be no greater bracha than this.
Yeshkayach, Dr. Lamb. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your dinner.